Welcome to One Bite is Everything, the podcast that connects every bite you take to the bigger world. Because food isn't just food, it's connected to everything you hold dear. Your personal and family health, the vibrancy of your community, and the resilience of your local and regional economy that translates to your wallet. All of that from your very own dinner plate. I am your host, Dana DiPrima. Today I want to talk with you about the new Dietary Guidelines for Americans. And before you decide that you already know what this is, or tell me that you've heard it all from nutrition experts and policy wonks, I want to tell you what I think is hiding in plain sight. First off, these guidelines are always, by law, a joint effort between Health and Human Services and the U.S. Department of Agriculture. That's not new. What feels new this time is the posture, the visibility, the way the Secretary of Agriculture is not simply a signature at the bottom of the page, but a prominent co-voice in how the guidelines are being framed publicly, including language about realigning the food system, about supporting American farmers and ranchers, and even about affordability. That shift matters because it moves this conversation from personal nutrition advice into a claim about the system itself, even if no one is talking about that. In fact, when I read the guidelines, I see this issue as most prominent, and I am frustrated by the experts' focus on all the shiny objects and mere shape of the pyramid and the positioning of certain food groups. And here's what I have not seen in the broader conversation so far. I have not seen many people treat that claim like it deserves to be treated, as a systems promise. People are reacting to what's on the plate. They're arguing about protein and tallow. They're arguing about grains. They're arguing about what's back or what's downplayed. But almost nobody is asking what I think is the central question. If the federal government is now framing the dietary guidelines as a realignment of the food system, then the relevant question is not, do we like the dietary and nutritional advice? The question is, can the system actually deliver it, and will our policies follow through? This episode is not a hot take. Well, maybe a little. But more than that, it's a thinking episode. I want to walk through the parts nobody is noticing, anchor it in cold facts, and then ask what a real alignment would actually require. Let's start with the phrase that has been repeated and shared. Eat real food. It sounds obvious. It sounds even comforting. No more processed foods. It sounds like a reset, like an escape hatch from all the confusion. But in the United States, eat real food is not a small behavioral suggestion. Ultra-processed foods, or UPFs, still make up roughly half or more of the calories in the American diet, including kids. That is not a character flaw of American families. That's an outcome of decades and decades of decisions that have made food cheaper, more shelf-stable, more profitable, and more engineered to be irresistible. So when guidelines call on Americans to eat more real food, they are not simply telling people to pick different items at the store. They are implicitly asking the country to shift away from the current dominant food economy. If that is what we're doing, then realignment is not a metaphor. Realignment means production shifts. It means processing shifts. It means procurement shifts. It means incentives shifts. It means the risk and the cost move, and the question is always, who carries those risks and those costs? You can't have eat real food without having an answer to the system question underneath it, even if those answers don't fit neatly on a pretty guideline graphic. The language that grabbed me most is the statement that we are realigning our food system to support American farmers, ranchers, and companies who grow and produce real food, and that the goal is to ensure that all families can afford it. That's a big sentence. It's also a very high bar. It's not just describing what Americans should eat. It's describing what the country should build. And I think what has been missing is the simple reality check. We are not starting from neutral. We're starting from a system with deep structural dependencies. If you talk about supporting American growers, you have to acknowledge that a significant share of the produce Americans consume does not come from American farms, over 47%. If you talk about real food affordability, you have to acknowledge that the current price structure reflects what we have chosen to subsidize, insure, transport, process, and make convenient. I'm talking about corn, soy, and cotton, most of that for livestock feed, inputs to processed foods, and slated for export. If you talk about calling on farmers, you have to acknowledge that farmers respond to markets and policy. They don't create national infrastructure alone. So I want to take this sentence seriously, not as rhetoric, but as a measurable claim. What would it take to make it true? Here is one of the facts that should be a centerpiece of any realign the food system discussion. By value, nearly half of the fruit and more than a third of the vegetables Americans consume are imported. Again, this is not a moral argument. It is not a purity statement. It is a systems argument. It means that when Americans are encouraged to eat more produce, the current supply chain is not automatically set up to translate that demand into income for American growers. It means that there is a gap between aspiration and capability. And that gap exists for reasons that are not mysterious. Seasonality matters. Labor availability and affordability matters. The cost of harvesting matters. The lack of regional aggregation and cold storage matters. The fact that many produce farms are asked to carry enormous risk without the same safety nets available to other crop systems matters. If realignment is real, it would show up in the parts of the system that determine whether a grower can say yes to increased demand. It would show up in infrastructure, in processing, in transportation, and in market guarantees. Because here is what I worry about if this stays rhetorical. If the message tells Americans to eat more produce, but the system doesn't change, then growers are not supported. They're pressured. They're expected to expand into constraints that haven't moved. Realignment means moving those constraints. If we're not doing that, we're not aligning. We're simply rebranding responsibility. Now let's talk about protein for a second, not as an identity debate, but as structure. In beef, large feedlots dominate finishing. In chicken, contract production is the overwhelming norm, and in pork, integration is deeply embedded. Bottom line is that the system favors industrial production of proteins and is stacked against the smaller, diversified producers who could get more real food into American communities if key barriers were reduced. Those realities matter because when guidelines encourage more whole food protein patterns, it raises a question that rarely gets said out loud. When demand shifts, who is positioned to capture the value? In an ideal world, increased demand for real food would translate into more viable independent farms and ranches, more regional supply chains, and more resilient communities. But that only happens if the bottlenecks and the power dynamics are addressed. Because if demand rises inside a highly consolidated system, it does not automatically produce diversification. It can produce more concentration, and that concentration has inherent risks that become most obvious when there's a disruption, like the pandemic and like global and regional political conflicts. That's what systems do. They route opportunity toward existing infrastructure, and that's not always the best move. So if the government is calling this a realignment that supports farmers and ranchers, then the farm side version of that promise sounds like this. We will not only tell Americans to eat food that is more directly connected to farming, we will make it possible for a wider set of farms to supply it. We will make it possible for ranchers not already tied to a narrow channel to access processing and markets. We will make it possible for smaller operations to meet demand without being forced into contracts that strip autonomy or pricing power. If you don't change those conditions, you can still change the messaging, but the system doesn't realign. It simply makes the messaging weak and impossible to fulfill. The word I keep circling here is afford, because it's easy to say and it's really hard to operationalize. Affordability is not determined primarily by willpower or education. It's determined by policy, markets, and structure. It's determined by what gets subsidized, what gets insured, how risk is managed, what infrastructure exists, and what kinds of food are cheap to manufacture and distribute at scale. In the most recent official data, grocery prices are still higher than they were, and different categories move at different rates. Meat, poultry, fish, and eggs have had particular volatility, and families feel that. So when the guidelines pair eat more real food with ensure all families can afford it, I want to treat that as a serious commitment, not a tagline. Because if the government truly intends to make real food affordable, then the approach cannot be limited to telling people what to choose. It has to include how the country is using public dollars to shape the food environment. Which brings us to the quiet part that most people avoid because it's complicated and it's political. Subsidies. A lot of federal support flows through commodity programs and crop insurance premium subsidies. This is not a conspiracy, it's a design. It is the architecture we've chosen to stabilize production, manage risk, and protect farm income within a particular system. But we should be honest about what that architecture tends to favor. It tends to favor scale. It tends to favor crops and models that are already deeply integrated into commodity supply chains. It tends to stabilize ingredients and inputs that feed industrial processing, animal feed systems, and export markets. That can coexist with real food production, but it doesn't automatically prioritize it. So when the guidelines say, realign the food system, the question becomes less philosophical and more concrete. Do we intend to realign the incentive engine, or do we intend to realign the messaging while leaving the incentive engine intact? Because if you keep funding one set of outputs and asking for another, you create tension that gets resolved somewhere. Often it gets resolved by consumers paying more, by farmers carrying more risk, or by consolidation increasing because scale can survive that conflict a little bit better. This is the moment where the tail wagging the dog is not just a clever phrase, it's a diagnostic. If the guidelines become the dog and the policy follows as the happy wagging tail, we should see changes that make whole food production more viable and more resilient. If the guidelines remain the tail, we'll see a lot of talk about real food, and the system will continue to optimize for the same output it has now, not more real food. The guidelines call on farmers, ranchers, health professionals, educators, community leaders, industry, and lawmakers. That sounds like shared responsibility, and in some ways it is. But we have to be honest about where the power lives. Farmers cannot realign markets by themselves. They respond to contracts, to prices, to access to processing, to procurement rules, to transportation, to labor realities, to insurance design, to what buyers demand. So when the federal government calls on farmers, I want to hear what it is calling on itself to do, because a call without alignment can become a trap. It can sound like validation while placing new expectations on the very people operating with the least cushion. This is where I want independent growers and ranchers to stay clear-eyed and not be wooed by being included in the headlines. You cannot measure support by language. You measure it by whether your risk decreases, whether your market access increases, whether you have more options, whether you have more pricing power, whether the infrastructure around you strengthens. If those things do not change, the system has not realigned. It has simply issued empty guidance. If you want to know whether these guidelines are operational or aspirational, as an example, we can look at institutional purchasing, schools, hospitals, and the military. These are places where the government is not just advising, it is buying. It is setting standards, contracts, and budgets. If we want real food to be accessible, these institutions are not a side note. They are a proving ground. Do kitchens have the equipment and training to prepare more whole foods? Are budgets aligned with the cost of real ingredients? Are procurement rules written in a way that allows smaller and mid-scale producers to compete, or do they default to the same massive suppliers? If realignment is real, we should see it here, because procurement is where a guideline becomes a supply chain signal. And supply chain signals are what farmers can actually build around. I want to end where I began. This is not an episode meant to clap or condemn the new dietary guidelines for Americans. It's an episode meant to take the words and signals seriously. When the dietary guidelines are framed as realigning the food system, and when the Secretary of Agriculture is visibly positioned as part of that message, it creates a moment of accountability, not for families, not for individual eaters alone, for policy, for budgets, for infrastructure, for incentives. If the national message is shifting toward real food, then the system has to move too. Otherwise, we end up in the same place we've been for years. We tell people what they should do, but the structure makes it harder and more expensive to do it. And for farmers and ranchers, especially independent ones, the question that matters most is not whether the message feels supportive. It's whether the system changes in ways that make survival more possible. Are we being supported, or are we being reassured with promises that have no backing? That is the question I'll be watching in the months ahead. I hope you will too. Thanks for listening to One Bite is Everything, the podcast that connects every bite you take to the bigger world. If today's conversation sparks something for you, remember, the stories you hear here don't end when the episode does. Through the For Farmers movement, these stories become action, supporting small farmers and bringing eaters like you closer to the people who make your food possible. Learn more at forfarmersmovement.com. You can also follow along for more facts and red flags on Instagram at XOXOFarmGirl. If you enjoyed this episode, please take a moment to rate and review One Bite is Everything on Apple Podcasts or wherever you are listening to this episode. It really helps more people like you find the show. It is my goal to get 100 of you to review the show this year. So please be one of those reviewers, and I will keep making weekly episodes that bring you new thought leaders or questions about important topics like today's episode. One Bite is Everything. It starts on your plate, and it has a big reach. It's a food podcast, and a policy podcast, and a health, community, and economy podcast, because food touches quite literally everything. Special thanks for the excellent sound design and original music, as always, by Russell Chapa. I'm your host, Dana DiPrima, and I will see you again here next week for another episode of One Bite is Everything. Until then, eat like it matters, because it does.